Right, so there's a brand new data privacy initialism that I need y'all to know about called the GDPR. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and then sort of crosswalk it between what already exists, the Student Data Privacy Act, and BERPA. Yeah, that. I presented on this during the spring training, but I know a bit more now. Time has passed. So the objectives today, I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll understand the Government Data Privacy Act. And I'm hoping that we can find some simple strategies for compliance. I've been feeling kind of stressed about this because I'm worried that I feel bad that there's always these new burdens that are foisted upon y'all all the time, every new legislative session, and this is just another one. But I think that there are ways that can make it easier for you to be in compliance with it. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish today. And then also finding some ways that our team can help you to make your lives a little easier. So let's dive into it. That text is so small on this screen. But here are the basics. So all government entities, which includes all of y'all, must implement a privacy program to protect all personal data. So not just student data, but educator, staff data, anything that's personal data now needs to be protected by government entities. Then you have to provide notice and provide training and allow amendments and corrections to data, etc. Annually, you must also report any data sharing or selling to the Office of the State Auditor. So you already do a compliance check with us, and then there's another report that you have to do annually there, as well as with the Cyber Center. So we'll go into the details of that. This was enacted the last legislative session, but it builds upon some of the Consumer Privacy Act that already exists in Utah, as well as provisions that were already in GRAMA. So first, let's talk about this provision from the bill, which is implement a privacy program before May 1st, 2025, that includes the entity's policies, practices, and procedures for the process of personal data. So privacy program is not outlined in code. It's not defined currently. My understanding is that it will be at some point, but it's not right. So what does that mean exactly? Well, thankfully, you already have a privacy program. Schools are one of the few government entities, I think, that have been doing a good job with privacy so far because of the Student Data Privacy Act, because of BERPA. So y'all already have a privacy program. There are ways that you can mature it, and there are ways that they might require some more stuff for it. But the reality is that you're ahead of most other government entities. BERPA and SDPA are more stringent than the GDPA. So now you just need to incorporate your staff and educator data into some of your existing workflows. So some ways that you can mature your privacy program currently is by conducting data mapping and risk assessments. Data mapping meaning that you have an inventory of your data, you know where it is, how it's stored, who it's shared with, all of that. And the risk assessments, I wanted to call out this bill, this law created the Office of Data Privacy, which is a new office in the state. Denise from that office is working on a privacy impact assessment to distribute to government entities that I will probably, when that template comes out, try to tailor it more for education use. Privacy impact assessments are pretty common in industry and enterprise. Whenever you create a new program or a new process, you do a risk assessment to see if it's going to affect people's privacy. So that's what the privacy impact assessment is. Another way that we can ensure your existing privacy program is by implementing some common policies. In GDPA, surveillance is called out. It's a provision in the law that you can't covertly surveil people. So it would be good to have a surveillance policy if you don't already have one that's sort of codified in that sense. GDPA also calls out data retention, which again, we have the RAMP and your appointed records officers should already be doing that, but I'll call that there too. And subject to data access, GDPA requires you to have a process for people to amend and correct their data, which you should already have because of FERPA, but the difference now is that we would then be translating that to educator use as well. So if a teacher says that their last name is wrong or their birthday is wrong, you need a process for them to correct or amend that information. Similar to FERPA, you don't actually have to do it, but you do have to have a process to do it.
So when it says surveillance, is it been specific about like software or computer surveillance versus like, hey, we're going to record you in our building, or have they outlined that at all?
They haven't in code, no. I think that because this is for governmental entities, the surveillance is probably more security cameras, but I would say that it's a safe bet to have those same policies for that content filtering and monitoring, etc.
Yeah. I think it's fairly easy to throw those just into like our acceptable use policies if there's not something already, right? But like we have to content filter because of like 8 different laws and money. So and if it's saying content filtering mean we're disclosing that we're surveilling you, or do we need to indicate content filtering is a type of surveillance?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say that as long as you have that transparency, as long as you have those policies, as long as people know that they're being surveilled in whatever definition you want to call that, I think that you're good there. It calls out, and I think I have this on the next slide. Go to that next slide. But the bill calls out that you can surveil people covertly if it's required by law, but still, I would not, I don't think that any of y'all are doing that. I would recommend that. So,
where do products like Gaggle come in? I don't know if our city's still using Gaggle. You are? We are too. Because that's doing a little bit more than just content filtering.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that I feel about pretty strongly about even outside of this law, is that it's important for us to be really transparent about that with our stakeholders, with teachers and with students and with their parents, that they know exactly what we can see.
So is the GDPA focused on communicating about what our policies are, or that there is a policy and we communicate?
So the GDPA, I think, mostly is meant to sort of spur government entities into doing a lot of these things because there might not be a process for them across the state. So, like I said, I think that schools and LEAs were already ahead of the game in so many ways. So I don't think that even the Office of Data Privacy is really thinking that far ahead right now. They just want people to be aware that, you can't surveil people covertly. But they're not, I doubt that they're really thinking about these minutiae in terms of the content filtering. So I think that the transparency is really more important for that.
So do you think you'd recommend when it's being communicated that it's being communicated as kind of discrete parts? Here's a link to where the surveillance info is. Here's a link to where the content filtering is, just that it's almost granular in terms of where people can find things.
Yeah, and I suppose that's just where that will be more of a decision by your individual LEAs, right?
Yeah.
How you want to go about that. But however you do it, I just think that the transparency is really important. Like for the law, it's just a matter of having those policies and making people aware of them. But beyond that, in terms of those best practices, I just think it's important that we're having these conversations with our stakeholders. I wanted to talk about some of the deadlines in the bill. So between May of this year and January of 2027, you're supposed to identify any non-compliant processing activity, document it, create strategy to bring it into compliance, and then ideally bring it into compliance by 2027. So compliance in this case meaning what's in the duties section of the GDPA, which is what we're going over now. Which a big part of that is that you can't sell personal data unless required by law, and you shouldn't be sharing personal data unless permitted by law. I doubt that any LEA in here is selling personal data, so I think that, and y'all are sharing it as permitted by law because of FERPA exceptions, et cetera. So I believe that you're already in compliance there, so it would be more of that, the processing in terms of this middle piece. Because the bill does specifically call out data minimization, which is, obtaining and processing only the minimum amount of personal data reasonably necessary to achieve a specified purpose. So as we're looking into the data that we collect, just ensuring that we're not storing things that we don't need to, ensuring that we're not collecting information like if a teacher is applying for something, maybe you don't need their social security number on the application, depending on what the purpose is. So just being really cognizant of that. The data minimization is like a choice that you constantly make every day. I think of it like Marie Kondo. You just you look at the data and you ask if it sparks joy, and if it doesn't, then you get rid of it or you don't collect it. Next slide. Okay, so do we have any questions or comments so far? Oh, I should have been probably restating questions.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
Yeah. I know we already had a little bit of discussion so far, but any other questions?
Just a reminder, this is from page 491 last year.
It is, yeah. So it instituted the Government Data Privacy Act, which is 63A 19101.
Oh, you're looking at me.
I think. I have a link to it at the end of the slideshow. Yeah. Okay, we can move on. Okay, so this is an activity that's on Nearpod that I wanted us to sort of walk through together, sort of crosswalking what we understand about SDPA, FERPA, and GDPA so far. Yeah, we were talking about this on the way up, so some questions. So the first option there protects personal data. Where do we think that fits into these categories? Thoughts? Hopefully all three, right? Probably direct things like that. Yeah. Okay, perfect. All three of these different laws are focused around protecting personal data. It's just the definitions of personal data are a little different. So to that end, the second option here applies to student data. Which of these three apply to student data? Thoughts, anyone? Definitely. And GDPA as well, because the GDPA definition of personal data is really broad. It's those direct and indirect identifiers, just any information that identifies that's linked to them reasonably. Applies to educator data, which would be applied to our staff and our teachers, their personal data. GDPA, yeah, that is the only one that directly applies to educator data. Read this.
Establishes data manager role.
Establishes the data manager role. Which of these did that? SDPA, yeah. Requires process to amend or correct data.
The GDPA.
GDPA does, yeah.
FERPA does as well.
FERPA does as well. And this is one where we were like, I don't know about SDPA. There is a section in there about expunging, etc. So that's probably. And I think we only have like. We might want to move on actually. But
10-10.
oh, okay, never mind. We can finish this. So SDPA calls out that you can expunge non-necessary student data, that a parent has the right to do that. But then when we were talking about FERPA, it mentions just amending or correcting data. So then we were like, well, is deleting data amending if something's inaccurate? So I actually didn't know if FERPA had that in there, but
We all decided that we didn't.
yeah. Contains retention provisions. Which of these apply to that?
FERPA. Isn't that what determines, like, you have to have a retention schedule?
No, FERPA, from my memory, doesn't have anything in it specifically about record retention, which I thought was interesting. So part of the SDPA, it seemed, was taking some of the vagaries that were in FERPA and making them a little more codified. So SDPA definitely has the retention provisions, and so does GDPA, which is called out in there, in terms of quality grant. Data governance requirements. That, which I think I haven't really talked about it with GDPA, but the process of having a privacy program is data governance in itself, so that would apply there. In SDPA, it's called out a little more bluntly. You're supposed to have your data governance plan accessible for your stakeholders. Yeah. Oh, individuals can request data deletion. That's the one where there was some confusion there. Definitely SDPA. Interestingly, GDPA does not talk about data deletion. I've heard them say that maybe it's something that they might, like the Office of Data Privacy, I've heard them say it's something that they might consider in the future, but right now it is just amending or correcting data, not necessarily deleting. Which makes sense from a government standpoint because, you know, I can't just tell every government entity to delete my data. It's probably something to work. Requires consent or exception for data sharing. Definitely FERPA, right?
Yeah.
And SDPA by extension. But not necessarily GDPA. It just mentions that if you're sharing, it needs to be lawful. Marketing restrictions. This one I thought was kind of interesting too, because again, FERPA is pretty vague about it. It doesn't specifically say that you can't use data for marketing, but instead that you should only be sharing data with a specified purpose, and there should be an exception and consent. So that sort of precludes marketing. But in SDPA, it calls it out more specifically that we can't have be sharing data for targeted advertising, and GDPA doesn't allow you to sell data either. So yeah, those two there. Thank you for that. I think the goal of that was that I wanted you to see that you're already doing so much of that, and there is so much crossover between these three things. I also want to ask here, who in the room knows Nora? A few. So Nora just took over for, I don't even know if it's confirmed yet necessarily, but for Whitney Phillips, who you might have known before too. She used to work at USD. But Nora is at the office called a political subdivision. She is the one that you will be doing an annual report to for the GDPA requirements. Like I said, the GDPA law created the Office of Data Privacy, so there are these two separate offices, and it's a little confusing because they're similar and they have similar goals. But the Office of Data Privacy is more for the executive branches of government that directly report to the government, whereas the Office of the State Auditor is for political subdivisions like counties, cities. So I bring that up because of the annual report. So it mentions in the law, a designated governmental entity shall annually report to the state officer the types of personal data currently shared or sold, the basis for sharing or selling the personal data, the classes of person and governmental entities that receive the personal data. And again, here's that definition of personal data. It means information that is linked or can be reasonably linked to an identified individual or an identifiable individual. We can go to the next slide. So when I read through that annual report section, for me, it sounded kind of familiar. The types of personal data currently shared or sold sounds a lot like the data inventory that would be accomplished with an Exhibit B. The basis for sharing or selling the personal data sounds like purpose justification. Metadata dictionaries, and the classes of persons and governmental entities that receive the data sounds like a list of data recipients, which you have in your metadata dictionaries too, in terms of the vendors, and we list the testing and the state and all of that. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So that's sort of the similarity that I saw there, but the actual report template that Nora's team has available right now, kind of hard to see on the screen, but I find it a little confusing. It asks you to list the types of personal data shared or sold in categories, and then the types of people that receive it.
I, like, when I was thinking about how y'all would fill out this report, it just didn't really make much sense to me. So we can go to the next slide. I'm hoping, and again, you know, this is, the GDPA is unrelated to us, but I'm hoping that Nora would be okay with allowing y'all to just provide a link to your metadata dictionary to fulfill the requirements of that report, at least for the most part, because you have that information that's in there. Our team is looking to incorporate educator data into the Exhibit B for the NDPA 2.0. So, you know, in the Exhibit B, which we see on the right here, it lists all the data elements that a vendor requests. So we would have an exhibit in there, probably in Exhibit G, that would have teacher and educator data too. So then over the next 3 years, as those old DPAs expire, and you're signing the new DPA 2.0, which doesn't expire, then we would have that data inventory for educator data as well. So between, yeah, I already mentioned that. So I would recommend, and this has never been a requirement from us, and so this is just a recommendation, that if you were to extract those elements from the Exhibit B into your metadata dictionary, that would serve as that data inventory and it would meet the requirements for the GDPA for having that list. And then when asked, you might be able to provide a link to that. So I believe that Nora is looking to ask for this report sometime next year, probably in May, I would guess. The top of the report mentioned by August, but I think that it will probably be around May. So between now and then, you don't have to do all of that because, again, the deadline for finishing all of this is January 2027. You would just have to start the process and then have that documented. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping, is that they'd be okay with just a link to the metadata dictionary, which would make all of your lives much easier because you're already doing that. So next slide. So this is just a checklist. Again, it's optional, really, right now, because the GDPA requirements have nothing to do with us. But if I were you, I would extract the data elements from Exhibit B into your metadata dictionary, partner with your HR or other administrators to determine additional apps that receive educator data, like finance apps, payroll, time cards, things like that. Add those apps and data elements into your metadata dictionary as a custom resource, which to that point, I'm sure that many of you have heard that if you participate in the DTL program, you know, you used to have access just to Learn Platform, but now there are 4 different options. I'm still trying to get demo accounts for those other 3 so that I can see what it looks like to have a metadata dictionary in there. So I'm still working on that because I don't really know what it looks like in ClassLink or Global Grid for Learning or Lightspeed. I'm going to compile a list of all of the data that is shared to USBE, teacher data, student data, et cetera, so that we have that in a readily accessible place for the requirements of this. And then one sort of random call out at the bottom here is I would check your websites. If you use an analytics service like Google Analytics or Microsoft Insight or something like that, if you haven't configured them to be more anonymous and just for tracking, you could have remarketing features or advertising features turned on, and that could constitute data selling. So check your website tracking cookies, because that might be something that you've overlooked. Okay.
When you say partner with HR and other administrators to determine additional apps, they want to know if it would be wise to initiate DPAs with those programs that use educator data, but student data.
I guess there's a difference between something that's wise and something that's required. So that feels like an optional thing to me. It probably would be a good thing to do that, but it's definitely not a requirement. The only requirement for GDPA is that you just know what that data is and you're able to speak to it, that you're sharing it lawfully, that you're not selling it, you know where it is, how it's stored, and who has it. So I agree that that could be a good idea, but it might not be, necessary. Depends on your bandwidth, I suppose.
So if I rephrase that, the GDPA isn't necessarily requiring that we have data sharing agreements in place, but the overlap with what we currently do with agreements is significant.
Yeah, it is. Because again, SDPA is more stringent and strict than GDPA is. And so you're already doing so much of this anyway. So if you just incorporate teacher and educator data into that workflow over time, I just think that that makes it a lot easier for y'all to be in compliance with that. Because I don't, I can't speak for what other requirements they might add to the GDPA in the future. So I think it's good to sort of have that forward-facing look at, okay, how can I mature some of these privacy practices? But also, I don't want you all to feel stressed about that and think that that's just like something that you have to do right now because who knows what they're going to require. And I think that for what they require right now, y'all are already doing pretty much all of it. There's not much else there. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah. Oh, well, perfect. Questions or comments about that plan? Does anyone have any other questions?
So you mentioned looking at some of the other programs that people use for metadata dictionaries. Do you have any specifics about Learn Platform? Like, is it a question of just having filters? Like, I could say, where's my employee data? Any of those tools that are
Yeah, so
data, they're just tagged?
yeah, I had mentioned earlier about looking into the other EdTech management programs and how to use them for metadata dictionary. And he was asking if it's just a matter of looking at the filters in Learn Platform and getting the educator data in there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the reason I bring that up is because when I worked at an LEA, I was really familiar with Learn Platform. Like I had extracted all of those Exhibit B data elements using those tag lists and tags and tag lists. I don't remember what they were called exactly. So I know how to do that in Learn Platform, but I don't know how you would do that in the other three options that you're going to have access to now. So my hope is that I can get access to some demo accounts for those three applications to figure out how y'all would be able to do that, just so I can help and create some guides and things like that, because I don't know what it'll look like in there.
But in proof of concept, and saying we need to be able to demonstrate where the data goes. If we applied it that way with tags and data elements, really easily filterable. You're saying that's meeting the spirit and letter of the law.
Yeah, well, my hope more is that that will meet the spirit and the letter of the law.
Another report.
Yeah, because that report, again, when I looked at the template, and I can share that template, it just seemed like I didn't know how y'all would be able to do that. It felt so cumbersome, and you already have all of this information available for our compliance purposes. So my hope is that there can be that overlap there where the Office of the State Auditor would be okay with that. And I plan on talking to Nora about that as she knows more about what she's looking for. So I'll let you know when that happens. At this point, it's more just like being aware that that's potentially something that could help to meet those requirements, because again, I would hope that you wouldn't have to fill out the report the way that it is right now, because it feels cumbersome, unless they're not looking for that much information, but I don't know. Yeah. Another thing that you might have noticed when you registered for our fall conference was that we had this collection notice at the top. These collection notices are also a new requirement under GDPA. When you collect any personal data from someone, you need to, and we can go to the next slide so I can remember exactly what it's called out, even though this infographic is so small here. You have to provide why the data is being collected, how it will be used, consequences for not providing the data, which sounds very threatening, but I think it's actually more like, hey, if you don't give me your address, I can't send you this thing. A list of any other people or entities that will have access to the data, and the record series that the data will fall under. You can see I added the retention period to this collection notice, but you don't have to do that. That's not a requirement. But adding the record series is a requirement. So that GRS 150 that's on there, that's a requirement. Another tip that I would give for this is that I had heard the IAPP give the recommendation that if you have a public-facing policy to rewrite it for a 5th grade reading level. So when I wrote this collection notice, I put it into Gemini, I think, and asked for that which seemed to help with sort of rewriting it, just so that it's very clear for people and in plain language instead of sounding very legal-y. So these collection notices are a requirement too, and that leads us to the next activity, which is more for my benefit. I'm hoping, again, to try to save you from doing more work than you have to do. I'm hoping to provide just templates of collection notices for common things that you use, common times that you request data from people. So I'm hoping that you can fill in this board and brainstorm anytime that you request personal data from someone. So like registration, enrollment, maybe like a sporting event, an application. Anytime that you're asking people for personal data, I would just like you to brainstorm this here, and then that way I can take this and create some collection notice templates for y'all later, so you don't have to do it. It would be both student and educator and or parent, anytime you're collecting personal data from someone. And we'll take just a couple of minutes to brainstorm this, but. Oh, okay. And I think that Nearpod will save this, but could you just take a picture with your phone, just in case? Okay.
Jeremy,
Mhm.
someone mentioned climate surveys and student surveys. It might be worth noting that those surveys require an additional layer of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Which maybe you could speak to that as the expert.
Yeah, so maybe just a reminder that GDPA requires, actually, can I borrow your mic?
Yes.
So just a reminder, I'm really struggling. Just a reminder that GDPA requires the data collection notice, but also there's that separate law around student surveys that requires a specific kind of notice be given to parents when you're collecting consent for those surveys. So I think it would be possible to include this collection notice in the survey consent notice, but there's more requirements for that than there is for this, so.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, we can move on from this activity, but thank you for providing all of these. I will go through them and, like I said, make some templates and make those available in a Google Drive so that you don't have to look up record series and things like that, because it can be cumbersome. And my understanding too is that the state archives, they're working on redoing the general retention schedule anyway, so those are going to change at some point. But yeah.
First of all, what if you are sending them to a third party to collect the data? Do you need a data collection notice in that case? Like, for example, register my athlete.
Are you still going to be the data owner? Like, are you still maintaining that data? Because if you are, I would say that you would still need a collection notice, or maybe you can share it with the third party. It depends on where the data is being stored, I
It
suppose.
says it lives in that system.
No, yeah, if it lives in that system, then you don't have to provide a data collection notice for that.
Because you're not the one collecting that data.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and then the other question is, what about staff surveys?
Staff surveys, yeah. If you just have a simple data collection notice at the top of that, yeah, because if it has their name or their email address or anything that would identify them, you do need to have that. The main reason for that is because it's called out in the bill that you should only be using data for its specified purpose. And that's a part of that data minimization piece. So if I collect data from someone for a registration form, I shouldn't be using that data to send them solicitations. I shouldn't be using that data to send them advertising or marketing or anything like that. I should only use it for that purpose. So that's a big part of GDPA, and being transparent about that. Again, Whitney told a really interesting story about this that I can't quite remember, but something about how if you register for a hunting license in Utah, that information is shared with, I shouldn't even bring up the story because I don't remember. If you owe child support, you can't get a hunting license, something like that. But there wasn't transparency about the fact that that information was being shared. So that's a big part of it, is making sure that we're using the data only for what we're saying that we're using it for. And that's the purpose of the data collection notice.
You have another question?
Just an acronym question, GDPR, GDPA, same?
No, so yeah, GDPR, and that's why it's the alphabet soup, right? So GDPR is, of course, the privacy regulations that are in the EU. So GDPA is a Utah-specific law, the Government Data Privacy Act.
So the fact that University of Utah has a GDPR notice is just because they like.
If you handle data for somebody that lives in the EU, you do still have to follow GDPR, is my understanding. And so I'm sure that the EU has to think more about GDPR than most of us do. Yeah.
I thought maybe I caught him on something, but.
Yeah. But yeah, the acronyms are, it's a lot. Anyway.
You have an additional question. What about anonymous feedback surveys? If it's anonymous, do you still have to give a data collection?
If there's no personal data, no. Yeah, so if it is completely anonymous, like truly anonymous, like not even their IP address anonymous, then no, you don't have to. But if their IP address were on there, then I would say yes, you probably do. Thank you. And then another thing that was in GDPA is new data breach reporting and notice provisions. So a data breach that affects 500 or more individuals requires reporting to the Utah Cyber Center within 5 days of discovery. And again, I don't know how they're going to do this exactly, but GDPA also mentions that even if you have a data breach that affects fewer than 500 people, you should be keeping a log of that, and that the Cyber Center may request an annual report of those smaller incidents. So it would just be a log about them. And this is a reminder for something that already existed, again, in board rule because of SDPA, is that significant data breaches should be reported to us as well within 10 days. So if you ever have any questions about any of that, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer if I think that, it qualifies under those two things. I also have a document that sort of lays out the definitions of each, and that's at the end of this slide deck.
We had an opportunity to ask some questions about this in Jordan recently, including talking to the Cyber Center and going, hey, what do you actually want to know? When do we need to tell you or not? And they spent 4 or 5 days going back and forth on that themselves, saying, hey, well, you're the first one to actually ask, to which they had the AG respond and provide a definition for it, which pretty much said, it seems like USBE has that figured out, so we're going to just kind of copy that.
Oh, okay.
But it was, so Jeremy does have a really good document in terms of a lot of those things, and so I took a blatant copy of it and adapted it slightly to some of our internal processes and said, hey, look, here's this awesome internal resource I made. Totally stole it from Jeremy. But it was, in terms of like incident response plan or disaster recovery stuff, we had not necessarily thought through the importance of having that pre-outlined and decided about what it was. Because in all the different incidences or things that might happen, an inadvertent data disclosure is actually probably the most common thing that's likely to happen. And so having a run book or a playbook on what we do with it was actually super valuable in that aspect.
Yeah.
And the reality of the admission from the Cyber Center, they weren't even sure what to do with the fact I was calling them to tell them about it.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not actually calling you to tell you about anything. I'm just asking a theoretical question about if there were something to tell you, what should I tell you? Right? And that's where it turned into all of a sudden the AG kind of going, ah, right? And so like the cyber center director even said, you know, like it's now on our list to like get a form done internally on like what to even ask to collect. So a lot of these are nascent until they get used.
Yeah.
And so, but we did find in that conversation, even with the AG chiming in, that the data privacy team at USBE seems to be the gold standard, that everybody was like, hey, yeah. But that 500 was a super critical number in general. We even involved kind of Nora in that conversation.
Yeah.
There was some admission there of like, well, I'm not even sure what we would audit because we don't have clear definitions of what it is, but everybody seemed to really like that 500 consideration.
Yeah, and I think that that is the most important thing, is that 500 or more. And that's why, you know, I have it small underneath the other incidents for the annual report. Like David is saying, the Cyber Center is pretty nascent. I think that it was established in 2023. It's a pretty small group. I don't think that they're, you know, I can't speak for them, but the annual report, again, seems like a difficult thing for them to sort of manage as well. But the 500 or more is important, and they do have a reporting form on their website. We have the same information on a reporting form. So if you ever have an incident where you would need to report to both us and to them, you could fill out our form and then just copy that information into theirs because it mirrors it. And those resources are at the end of this slide deck as well. But yeah, that's a really good point, is that the Office of Data Privacy, they're brand new. The Cyber Center is pretty new, so they're all still working this out amongst themselves. Oh, 2 minutes? Okay. Next slide. I think we're almost finished anyway. Yeah, you do need to provide notice for anyone who was affected by a data breach. And the data breach definition under GDPR is pretty broad. Again, it's like misuse, it's access, it's on the previous slide. That notice has to have a description of the breach, the affected data, the steps you're taking to mitigate, and recommendations to the individual. And next slide. You can provide that notice by email or mail, text message or phone call, or public posting. The public posting, like if you have a data breach with data for a student who doesn't even go there anymore and you have no way of contacting them, that's where the public posting would be useful. Has to be somewhere where it's reasonable that they would be able to see it. So that's that. Next slide. Okay, there's also provisions in the law about, we're redoing our data privacy training. Currently, we already were redoing it, and we're going to incorporate all of that into it. So our training can meet the requirements of this, so you don't need to do your own. We do have a small module right now. If you have employees that only deal with educator data, we have a small module available for that. Employees that don't deal with personal data, they don't have to get trained on this. So yeah, again, I wouldn't worry about this because we're covering that for you. So next slide. Oh, and then there was a quiz. So that's it. We're done.
Right on time, unless you want to make them do the quiz.
No, I don't. Don't do the quiz. Any questions? Any lingering questions? Final comments?
They're wanting to know if the document that David referred to is something that you could make available to.
Oh yeah, it's on the slide deck. It's called Data Breach Reporting and Notification. It's in the resources section at the end.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Yeah,
Also referring to a policy that is instituted.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's not a policy, it's a procedure. Policy has to be done by that.
Yes.
That is procedure. Or we call it lowercase p.
Yeah, so that's a good point though. Some of those like run books or playbooks, it could be interesting to have those conversations with other districts that you have relationships with to see if they have anything like that.
So Jeremy, I've got one other question for data privacy. I know we've got our information security managers and data privacy managers. When it comes to GDPR, is there one that's more responsible for GDPR than?
No, so it doesn't call that out currently. That's where I think
the organization is.
Yeah. that's where I do think that that privacy program that's mentioned in there, when it does become more codified, that's where I think that that could live, because it is common in industry if you have a privacy program to have a data protection officer. So that might be a requirement, and that would be up to you to decide who would be your data protection officer, if it would be your data manager or your ISO. Some people, when I worked at a LEA, I was both, so you know that might be the case. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you all. Again, I would say don't stress too much about all of this. I don't know if that was like reassuring or not, but I think you're already doing an excellent job. And again, you are all so much farther ahead than most other government entities. So I think that you're a model for them. So thank you.